everyone, my name is Stonesy Boy and welcome back to Reading with Stonesy. Today we're reading pages 201 to 220. I don't really remember why one chapter is 20 pages, but hey, you know what? Maybe it's just so I can keep myself entertained. Next episode after this one is only going to be 16 pages, because this story ends on page 232. So if you would notice, I said the wrong number, when it should be 12 pages. And, not 16. You see, Stonesy Boy may be great at reading, but he sucks at math. That's not true. I actually am quite the opposite. I suck at math, but I'm suck at reading, but I'm great at math. You know, it's kind of a weird one, because I do content of... Oh, okay, a minute's already gone by, so I guess let's start. May have felt nauseous. We need to go. Bye, Miss Carpenter. Maya grabbed Noelle's hand and pulled her friend out of the teacher's house. In the driveway outside, Maya sucked in air that she smelled the ozone and damp earth. The thunderstorm had left as quickly as it arrived. The ground was soaked, and the sun's warmth was turning the wetness into a steam that drifted up in the dirt and pavement like an ethereal ghost. Maya leaned over and held her stomach. She felt dizzy and weak. "Are you okay?" Noelle asked. Maya straightened. She shot at Noelle a baffled look. "Didn't you see that?" "See what, Cecilia?" "She's a cute baby," Noelle studied Maya. "What's wrong with you?" Maya didn't have the time to think more about Miss Carpenter's baby. The rest of the day, well, wasn't true. Though she was busy, Maya couldn't really think of anything but Mrs. Carpenter's baby and Noelle's weird reaction to her. But it creeped Maya out so much she forced herself to focus on something else every time the image of the droopy, jawless, infant thing entered her mind. By the end of the day, she convinced herself she imagined the whole thing. Besides, the news she got over dinner shoved aside everything else. Her mom had now had cancer. They gave Maya this news calmly as Maya's mom dished up beef stew. Her dad handed around the bread basket, a basket that contained rolls that reminded Maya of Cecilia's figureless head. "Nope, stop it," she told herself. She was not going to think about that. Maya handed the basket to Alina without taking a roll. Maya wasn't hungry anyway. She picked up her spoon and swirled it in a stew, making circular patterns in the tarragon-scented broth. Her parents were going to die. How could they sit there eating if everything was okay? Why was Alina chattering about upcoming college classes? Maya stopped her spoon with a clatter. "Alina, stop it," she snapped. Alina froze with a baby head, no bread roll, halfway in her mouth. She lifted her eyebrows. "What's your problem?" she asked Maya. "How are you going to be able to go to school if Mom and Dad are gone?" Maya asked. She looked from Alina to her parents. Maya's dad patted Maya's hand. "Well, don't worry, sweetie. You and Alina will be fine. I know it seems like we don't have much, but we've been saving. There's plenty of funds to get both of you through school, and this house is paid for." Maya's dad turned to peacefully eating stew as if she had been discussing the day's thunderstorm. This was wonderful, hon, he said to his mom. As usual, Maya's mom smiled. She picked up the bread basket and offered it to Maya. "Are you sure you don't want a roll, sweetie?" Maya erupted from her chair, covered her mouth, and ran into the room. She barely made it to the bathroom before she threw up. Did she have cancer now, too? No, Maya didn't have cancer. Her mom took her to the hospital the next day. Doctors ran the usual tests. Maya, unlike most of the world's population now, was fine. Although fine wasn't the right word to describe Maya at all. There was nothing fine about her. Maya was a wreck. Although school had started again, it wasn't the way Maya had envisioned her senior year. For one thing, most of the regular teachers were dead or dying. Half her class was sick. Maya's favorite activity, choir, was canceled, as with there were most extracurricular activities. There weren't enough participants. Even so, no one acted as if anything was wrong. Maya had never liked watching the news. No one in her family did. They preferred talking about happy events, doing fun things, and keeping up with what was going on in the world. But lately, Maya couldn't stop watching the news. She found herself glued to the TV screen whenever they were within range of one. It was like watching a car wreck. It was horrifying, but she couldn't stop herself. The news mesmerized her, not because of all the doom and gloom, though. In fact, the news was the exact opposite of the panic it would resemble the current situation. Instead of the sober reports of illness and death, the newscast brightly updates of the number of people diagnosed, being treated, and dying. It was like watching a ticker tape of cancer stats. Scrolling across the screen, a backdrop of upbeat instrumental music was a newscaster's tripping narration. Another 342,128 people died in China yesterday, Bob, a poofy-haired female news anchor announced with it, giving a football score. "How are things in Europe?" "Similar, Pam. The last count was 312,572, Bob responded. "Britain has passed a mass cremation law to handle the large numbers of deceased. As freaky as these emotionless reports were, though, they weren't that kept Maya awake at night. Her eyes were glued open to darkness because she can't of cancer. Not even her own sick family kept her awake. No, she kept thinking close her eyes were the babies, or really the not babies. She couldn't stop thinking about the unfinished, vaguely baby-shaped things that were now passing for newborns in the world. Mrs. Carpenter's Cecilia was the first one that Maya saw, but she knew that Cecilia was an aberration. All new infants looked like Cecilia. None of the babies were normal. And worse than that, not only were they not born normal, but these new children weren't growing normally either. A couple days after seeing Cecilia for the first time, Maya had gone to the pharmacy. Skirting around the sidewalk under construction sign, Maya had spotted Mrs. Carpenter getting to her car. "Hi, Miss Carpenter," Maya called. "Hi, Maya. How's Cecilia?" Maya had asked, just being polite. She didn't really know anything about the thing Miss Carpenter called her baby. "Oh, she's great," Miss Carpenter said, and she gestured toward the passenger seat of the SUV. Looking past Miss Carpenter, Maya glanced at the bundle she expected to see strapped into a baby carrier. But what she saw at the passenger seat wasn't a baby-sized bundle, it was a child-size. What? Mass? So unstructured that it was a little more than vaguely human-shaped outline. The thing that Mrs. Carpenter called Cecilia was a drooping pile of gooey material spilling over the edges of the passenger seat. Unmoving, the child thing drooped across the leather lifelessly. But it wasn't lifeless. How could it be? It had more than quadrupled in size in just 2 days, and Mrs. Carpenter clearly didn't think it was strange. She probably didn't think it was strange because she interpreted mannequin creatures were everywhere now. They couldn't go anywhere without seeing one of the nauseating things in some stage of development. By Christmas, May's parents were constant in the hospital beds in the family living room, with IV drips in their arms. They lay their hands linked, watching old movies while Maya ran around trying to keep up with the care. Their care and Alina's care. Alina was sick too. She was the last of Maya's loved ones who got diagnosed. Jackson and Noel were dying. All of Maya's cousins were dying. Mr. and Mrs. Davis were gone. The twins were on their own, and they were sick and dying. Mr. Thompson had already died, and Mrs. Thompson was hanging on, barely. She was dying, and now her children were sick and dying, too. Everyone is dying. And the jelly-filled doll babies were being born right and left, growing, it seemed, faster and faster with each passing day. Unsettled numbers of them had started showing up in public. They were massing in parking lots, accumulating in street corners. They didn't move around. They just lay in clumps, like mounds of humanoid-looking debris, stacking up because no one was removing them. Maya couldn't understand why the mounds kept getting bigger and bigger. Where were they coming from? A couple of days before Christmas, Pastor Ben visited the house. When Maya opened the front door hesitantly, dreading that she would find a new neighbor, children, aka doll things, lying on the porch, she was beyond relieved to see her minister smiling at her as if she didn't have a care in the world. Maya threw her arms around the broad-shouldered man with unruly blonde hair. "Pastor Ben, you're still alive." Maya hadn't been to church in months. When was there the time for church? Besides, she'd been in the news and churches had been turned into clinics for the dying. "Still kicking," Pastor Ben chuckled. "Apparently it's not my time. Yet." Maya looked closely at Pastor Ben, and she realized he was sick too. His skin became gray, partly as she was seeing as everyone else she knew and everyone she didn't know. He lost a lot of weight since he had last seen him. He looked like a human hanger from his black shirt and his slacks. His white literal collar was now 2 sizes too big for him. Pretending that all was well, Maya opened the door and ushered Pastor Ben into the house. She motioned toward the living room where her parents were weakly but gamely singing Christmas carols. Pastor Ben smiled widely as greeted Maya's mom and dad. "What a joyful noise!" he exclaimed. As if it were perfectly normal, Pastor Ben grabbed a dining room chair and pulled it up next to Maya's dad's bed. And then he joined the singing, added his full baritone to Maya's mom's thready soprano and her dad's raspy tenor. Pastor Ben motioned to Maya, and she couldn't have a single fa-la-la-la-la in her. She gave him a wan smile and said, "I have to go." She ran from the room before she could finish. She was in the kitchen making a peanut butter sandwich for Alina, and Pastor Ben wandered a few minutes later. She looked at him and dropped the knife that she held. "What's going on, Pastor Ben? Why is everyone dying?" Pastor Ben lowered himself into the kitchen chair. "It's not for us to ask why. We're given each day to live, not to question." "But what about those things everywhere?" Maya asked. Pastor Ben frowned in confusion. "Things?" Maya gestured toward the street. "The jelly people." Pastor Ben looked lost. Maya threw up her hands, exasperated. "Those things that look like dolls made out of silicone inside of plastic wrap." Pastor Ben shook his head. "The Lord doesn't distinguish life based on appearance. All life is sacred." "But those things are lifeless," Maya shouted. "They're just..." "Is that peanut butter?" Pastor Ben interrupted. "I could use a sandwich. It seems like I never have time to eat with all the funerals and baptisms." Maya goggled at the minister. "You baptize those things?" Maya Ben smiled. "It's part of my job, Maya." Maya shook her head. What more could she say? She felt like he was on a sinking ship, but no one but her knew it was going on. No matter how much she ran around trying to sound the alarm, everyone continued to go on their business, as if the world was as it should have been. Sighing, Mia put a sandwich she'd been making to Alina on a saucer. She handed it to Pastor Ben. She patted her hand in thanks. Lifting the sandwich, Pastor Ben said, "The world is a paradox, Maya. A balance of good and bad. People are dying, yes, but life is proliferating. Not only are babies being born at an unprecedented rate, but they're also growing into adolescents and adults in a manner of just days instead of years. Tragedies and miracles tend to go hand in hand." Maya didn't even try to argue with Pastor Ben about his use of the word babies. He seeing what he wanted, but he was seeing what wasn't there. Or maybe she was the one not seeing what wasn't there. Were the jelly beings real? Yes, they had to be. Maya wasn't imaginative enough to conjure up those horrible things. Over the next several days, Maya tried to find the miraculous Pastor Ben had talked about. Miracles Pastor Ben had talked about. But it was hopeless. The minister was as delusional as everyone else. One night, late, after Maya was cleaned up Alina's vomit, emptied her parents' bedpans, and sung her mother, whose pain was no longer manageable, to sleep, Maya went outside her dormant flower garden, sitting on the little wooden bench her father had made for her a few years before. She stared at the brittle, bloomless stalks and tried to remember the lively colors that they used to fill the yard in the summer. As soon as she tried to picture the flowers, she realized she was having trouble seeing color at all. Everything was so faded and gray now. The sick and the dying, they were hueless shells, and the new mannequin things, they were sheer vessels, filling with nothing but limpid gel like human-shaped jellyfish. She'd done many times since her world had started falling apart. Mia felt for a gold rose. She held it tightly, and leaned back and looked at the constellations. Although the world beneath them no longer shone brightly, the stars still sparkled on opaque expanse of the night sky. Maya blinked and she looked at the stars. She inhaled sharply and sat up straight. The sparkle would trigger memory. It reminded her of the AR unit and the pizza plex. But what was that? Had all started going wrong, wasn't it? Maya had put her hand to her temple. A barely perceptible head pain was his daily companion that had begun in the morning after she was in the AR booth. But what did the pain have to do with everything else? Maya tried to remember what her Gran was first diagnosed with cancer. She couldn't recall how long after her birthday it was when Gran got sick. She probably didn't remember because at the time it wasn't noteworthy. Of course, it was upsetting and sad, but it wasn't in any particular what if. "Maya," a weak voice called out. Maya let go of her gold rose pendant, jumped up, and dashed into the house. Was that her mom or Lena? She ran first to her mom and found her asleep. She tore down the hall to her bedroom. Lena was reaching for a plastic bin in the nightstand. Maya grabbed it and positioned it under Lena's chin. As she held her sister's hair while Alina threw up, for the umpteenth time that day, Maya chastised herself for taking the time to sit outside. She didn't have the luxury of sitting under a star, and she didn't have time to ask, what if? All Maya had time for the next day and the next was running from one sick family member to a friend to another. She no longer bothered to go to school. There was only a few classes available anyway. She wouldn't have left the house at all if she could have helped it. She hated being out in the street. The jelly mannequins were all over now. They seemed to be multiplying faster and faster. They clustered up stores and blocked the sidewalks. There were knots of them everywhere that Maya had to go. And now how did they get where they were? Maya had never seen one of the things move. They had limbs, but the limbs did not seem to work. They could only lie around. They didn't talk either. How could they? They didn't have mouths. They didn't have organs or blood or brains. They weren't human. They weren't pretend humans. Inexplicably growing objects that never grew into anything that actually functioned. And they didn't just grow. They multiplied on their own. One day on their way to Jackson's house, Maya nearly crashed her bike when she saw one of the transparent creatures suddenly produce a smaller transparent creature. Maya wasn't close enough to the things, thankfully, to see clearly what happened, but it looked like a new link on life slipped out, a larger one, like an infant coming out of a birth canal. Maya clapped a hand over her mouth and stifled a scream. How was this possible? The jelly piles of jelly beings were birthing more jelly beings. Don't you think it's bizarre? Maya asked Jackson as she sat next to the bed one afternoon. She was trying to get him to swallow a protein drink. Jackson's parents had died weeks before. So had his older sister. He hadn't let that bother him. I can't take care of myself. We're all having to do that now, right? After he buried his family, he'd gone on as everything was hunky-dory. He was still read his science and philosophy books. He still danced to music blasted from his boombox. When he got sick, too, he'd gone downhill fast. Jackson managed a sip of vanilla protein shake Maya offered him, but he immediately spit it out. The sour vanilla odor made Maya's nose twitch. Maya tried again, but Jackson weakly pushed the bottle away. What's bizarre? He asked. His previously deep voice was barely audible, and it was scratchy, like his vocal cords were caught in brambles. All the things out there. Maya waved her hand toward the street, and she turned away as she caught a glimpse of several gossamer jelly creatures piled up outside the window. Jackson looked toward the window and shrugged. All experiences are valid. He coughed, blood-stained in his lower lip. Maya reached out and wiped Jackson's mouth. She looked at the clock. She had to go home and check on Alina. But what about Jackson? He could no longer take care of himself. Neither could Noelle. Her family's gone too. Maya had been racing from her house to Noelle's and Jackson's to several of her neighbors' houses for days. Only her parents, her two youngest cousins, and her sister were left in her own family. She moved her cousins into her own house so she could watch over them. I have to go, Maya said. I'm not sure my parents are going to last the rest of the day. Maya set the protein drink to Jackson's nightstand. Drink this when you can. It occurred to her that she had just talked about her parents' imminent death without crying. She figured her tear ducts had dried up. I'll be back in the morning, Jackson said. Maya checked Jackson's fourth. She quickly placed the bag dispensing his medicine. She might have to run out of tears, Maya thought, but she gained more nursing skills than she'd ever expected to have. When she started caring for all her sick friends and relatives, she could barely handle the cleaning duties without getting herself sick. Now she could wipe up the puke and pee, whatever else the body needed to expel without batting an eye. On top of that, she could now give painless shots and easily switch out IV catheters. Mrs. Thompson had taught her how to do that before the woman got so sick she couldn't do anything at all. Maya thought back when she used to have dreams for her future. Sometimes she thought about being a doctor. Sometimes she thought about being a biologist or a botanist. Now she didn't think about being anything. All she could do now is care for the people she loved. And she had to move if she was going to be there for everyone else to care. Maya leaned over and kissed Jackson's forehead. One of these greasy locks brushed against her cheek. Don't worry about me, Jackson Rats. Go take care of your sister. Jackson's eyes fluttered closed. He was asleep. Maya adjusted his covers. When he left his house skirting the jelly people, she cycled back home. By the time Maya returned to her house, she was shocked to find nearly surrounded by mounds of mannequin things. There were so many of them on the road, on sidewalks, in the alley behind the house. They had seemed to be more like one organism instead of several individual sacks of translucent jelly. Maya barely managed to squeeze past the congregation of things to get to the front door. Inside, she slammed the door closed and bolted it. Then she ran to the front window and dropped the blinds. It was only after plunging the room in total darkness she turned to check her parents, and she realized she wasn't hearing what she would be hearing. For the past few days, her parents' breathing had been profoundly labored. They inhaled as if sucking through a straw, and they exhaled in a watery rattle that Maya could barely stand to listen to. The sound of the struggle to get air had been relentless. It seemed to echo through the house, reaching Maya no matter where he was or what she was doing. But now the sound was gone. Maya switched on a lamp and crossed to her mom's side. Her mom was still, her eyes open and glazed. Maya gently closed her mother's eyes. Shifting her gaze to her dad, Maya saw his eyes were already closed, but he was just as motionless. He was gone too. Maya wanted to linger by her parents' side, but she didn't have time. She had gone too long. She needed to check her sister and her cousins. I love you, Mom and Dad, she whispered, and then ran to her parents' bedroom. Maya had put her youngest cousins in her parents' queen-size bed. She surrounded them with pillows so they couldn't fall out of bed. So now she picked up Axel and held him close. His cheeks were no longer pudgy. He didn't smile in a long time, but he was still accepting milk or juice, his favorite froggy sippy cup. Maya quickly got a cup and nudged the cup's opening to Axel's slack mouth. When she urged him to drink, he checked on his sister, Abril, who was 5. Abril had already been a tornado of a child, whirled constantly because she loved to dance, whipping from one activity to another. She'd never been able to stay still. Now Abril barely moved. Her usual perky, shiny pigtails were limp and lusterless. Maya had wanted to wash Abril's hair for days, but feeding Abril and her brother and the others, Maya had left the care for the presidents. Abril, Nina, Anya said. Logro's eyes fluttered open. Can you eat something? Continuing to hold a sippy cup for Axel. Maya tried to hand a small container of pudding to Abril. Abril closed her eyes and screwed up her face. She shook her head. At the same time, Axel reared back to the sippy cup and threw up all over Maya's chest. Maya quickly settled the boy in the bed and made sure he didn't aspirate any of the vomit. She cleaned him up as best she could and then hurried to the bathroom. Pulling off her shirt, Maya washed herself off. She left the bathroom and headed toward the bedroom. Grabbing a t-shirt from the back of the door, she pulled it open. She made a face when she got a whiff of sweat. His shirt wasn't much cleaner than what she'd just taken off, but she was out of clean clothes. She hadn't had the time to do laundry, and she couldn't remember the last time. Lena, lying limply in her bed, moaned. Maya rushed to her side. Checking the IV stand, she saw that Lena's Shrivenous bag was empty. She was in pain. Maya reached for a new bag. She realized there wasn't one. She'd forgotten to restock the supplies. She had to go back out. When she had clear that medical personnel couldn't keep up with all the sick and dying people, the government had set up chemotherapy dispensaries in every town. If you had insurance, you could just pick up the medication administered to yourself instead of going to the chemo wards if you were well enough to get it. Maya was the only one left in her family and her neighborhood who was strong enough to go anywhere. The last time she'd been to the dispensary, she tried to stock up with enough for everyone else she was helping. Obviously, she hadn't got enough. After giving Alina as much water as she could accept, trying unsuccessfully to give Axel and Abro more food, Maya had grabbed the car keys and headed into the garage. The dispensary was too far away for a bike ride, and besides, the jelly people made bike rides harrowing. It wasn't that these parallelly formed humanoid sacks were dangerous. As far as Maya had been able to tell, the empty bags that looked like vaguely human-shaped clear water balloons were Benjin. They didn't have enough substance to be malevolent, and even if they were, what could they do? They didn't move. But their existence was enough to creep out Maya. The things that were very wrongness sent shivers skittering along Maya's spine. Because she wasn't so unnatural, the doll people unsettled Maya, as if they stopped to think about it. Maya fully expected to become a threat sooner or later. The sheer volume of them was chilling. How long would it be before they covered the entire surface of the planet? She made sure she didn't stop to think about that very often. In the garage, Maya started her family's minivan before she heard the garage door opener. If the jelly people were heaped into the driveway, Maya wouldn't want to risk them spilling into the garage before she could get the van going. Maya barely waited for the garage door to clear at the top of the van before she put it in reverse and hit the gas. As she feared, several of the eerie mannequin things were in the driveway. Well, she plowed right over them if she needed to. Maya backed out hard into the garage and hit the opener button again. Because her gaze was on the road behind her, Maya wasn't sure if any of the jelly things slopped into her garage. She figured if they did, that she'd deal with that later. Once she had the van in the street, she was relatively easy to navigate through the collection of dumpy sacks. Besides the mannequin things, the streets were mostly empty. Nearly everyone was either sick or at home taking care of the sick. Maya only saw a few cars as she navigated through town. The rest were parked on the driveways or tuckled into the garages. Some were in parking lots where they weren't dropping dead where they stood. But that was what was weird about everything. It wasn't like the zombie apocalypse or anything. There wasn't a virus or killing chemical released in a foreign country. It was cancer. And although the disease was killing people quickly, everyone was why Maya's community now looked like a ghost town, quite literally. The doll things, if you ignored their odd jelly consistency and the fact that they didn't go anywhere, were uncannily similar to specters. But Maya knew they weren't ghosts. They weren't. Well, they weren't anything, actually. They had no heart, no emotion. They had no spirit. They were like globs of nothingness in the plastic containers, like human leftovers. When Maya had first seen Selena, the baby's head had reminded Maya of her family's dinner rolls. But now she saw jelly things were more uncooked dough than finished product of any kind. They were like batter waiting to go in the oven and to get baked. Nearing the dispensary, Maya's way was blocked of the road under construction side. She started to make a right turn to detour around it, but then she braked and started at the sign. Was with all the under construction signs she was been seeing. Maya frowned, her mind flipping back to the other signs, starting with the one that had been in front of the AR unit. She tapped her fingers on the steering wheel as she tried to attach a meaning to know how often she'd been seeing such signs. Her brain, however, couldn't come up with any coherent ideas about it. Finally, she shrugged and shook her head. She got the car moving again. Maya was able to drive the rest of the way to the dispensary without incident. There it was more challenging to avoid the aggregations of jelly things to get into the flat-roofed industrial building, and she managed it. There was only one woman left on duty behind the desk. She didn't appear to be much older than Maya. She might have been a college student before all of this had started, and she probably had been pretty. Now she was obviously sick herself. Her eyes were sunken and her complexion was the color of ash. Brushing a strand of oily brown hair in her face, the woman waved anyway. Maya's attempt to fill out the right paperwork. Just take what you need. The woman's voice barely whispered, like tissue paper rustling in the air current. Maya didn't argue. She filled the tote bag she thought with many and bravest bags of medicine she could stuff into them. But she rushed out of the building. In the parking lot, Maya was shocked to see that several piles of jelly people were now ringed to the outermost rows. Had it been there when she arrived? Had she just not noticed them? Maya didn't stop to consider the question because one of the large pyramid of the jelly people was now close to the minivan. She ran to the vehicle, threw it in the tote bag, and slammed the door shut. She had the engine turned over and the van in gear just as several new jelly beans tumbled off the nearest pile and landed near the front bumper. She backed up and tore out of the parking lot. Purposely, Maya kept her gaze straight ahead. She was not going to look in the rearview mirror to see what was behind her. On the way home, Maya considered stopping by the grocery store. She filled the kitchen with canned soups, cartons of pudding, and bottles of protein drinks. But she figured she could add what she had. But she got to the store, though. The parking lot was nearly buried with jelly things. They were everywhere, like jiggly containerless gelatin. She couldn't face even trying to make her way through the quivering mass. Wow, what a real standing, huh?
So this went from cancer to everyone dying, as the title suggests. And yes, I know what the title is already. To gelatin things. This is definitely one of the weirder FNAF books. Like, I've read some of them on my own time. It's just like, my family doesn't love me and blah, blah, blah. But, like, Tales from the Pizza Plex really goes in a weird mental psyche standing instead of the normal left and right. It's such a weird turn, but I'm also really digging it. But yeah, tomorrow, or the next video that's coming out probably tomorrow, is only 12 pages, so it's going to be a quicker video. But yeah, we're going to see the end of this, and most likely the end of this situation right here. So yeah, I hope you guys have a super fantastic, wonderful day. Be polite, be efficient, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I apologize for any nightmares, because goodness, this is in great detail. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye!